Today, we're talking about something that could actually affect your wallet in a real way, and it's coming straight from the Supreme Court. The court struck down a major set of tariffs put in place by President Donald Trump, and those tariffs already collected hundreds of billions of dollars. And now people are asking a very simple question. Do we get any of that money back? Because if you've bought groceries, appliances, or really anything imported over the past year or two, there's a good chance you paid part of those tariffs without even realizing it. So, yeah, this matters more than it might seem at first. And what happens next could affect your costs, your taxes, and even future checks you might or might not receive. So, stay with me here. Quick question for you. What would you do if you got paid a rebate check for the tariffs? Let me know in the comments. So, let's just start with what actually happened here. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that President Trump did not have the authority to impose these broad tariffs under a law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. Now, that law was originally designed for emergencies, things like freezing assets or blocking financial transactions during a crisis, not for putting taxes on imports across the board. And that's really the key issue. The court basically said, look, if you're going to tax goods coming into the country, Congress has to clearly approve that. The president can't just do it alone under a general emergency law. So, in plain terms, the tariffs were ruled invalid, not necessarily because tariffs themselves are illegal, but because of how they were put in place. And you might be thinking, okay, so what tariffs get removed, prices go down in a story. But here's where things get a little more complicated and honestly a little more interesting because the government already collected a lot of money from these tariffs. We're talking over $200 billion, and some estimates say at least $175 billion could potentially be subject to refunds. That is a massive number. And naturally, people are starting to ask, where does that money go now? And now here's the part that's kind of surprising. The Supreme Court didn't actually decide whether refunds have to happen. They left that question open. So right now, the answer is we don't fully know yet. And I know that's frustrating because it feels like a yes or no question, right? Either the tariffs were invalid, so give the money back, or they weren't. But legally, it's not that simple. You see, most of those tariffs were paid by importers, companies bringing goods into the US, and then those companies often pass the cost along to consumers, meaning people like you and me. So even if refunds do happen, it's not automatically clear who gets the money. Does it go back to the companies that pay the tariffs? Probably first. Do those companies then pass it back to consumers? Maybe, but not guaranteed. And that's where things start to feel a little messy. Even Justice Kavanaugh, who dissented in the case, said this could turn into a situation where the government might have to refund billions, and that the process could be, in his words, a mess. And when you hear that from Supreme Court Justice, you kind of know this isn't going to be quick or simple. So then, what about you personally? Like, what does this mean for your money? Well, research shows that tariffs did increase costs for households. Some estimates put it at over $1,000 per year for the average household, and in some cases, even higher. So even if you never saw a line item that said tariff tax, you likely felt it in higher prices. Things like electronics, cars, appliances, even some everyday goods, those costs tend to ripple through the economy. And that leads to the big question again. Will you actually see a refund check? Well, right now there are really three possible paths. For the first one, refunds go back only to importers. In this case, companies get the money, and consumers may or may not benefit, depending on whether prices come down or companies absorb it. This is probably the most straightforward legally, but not necessarily the most satisfying for everyday people. The second path, broader refunds or some kind of structure return. This could involve Congress stepping in and deciding how to distribute funds, possibly even sending money to households. There was even talk previously about something like a $2,000 tariff dividend, though that now looks uncertain given the ruling. And then the third scenario, no refunds at all or very limited ones. The government could argue that the tariffs were collected in good faith at the time, and that refunds would be too complex or disruptive. That would almost certainly lead to more lawsuits. And we're already seeing over 1,000 cases related to this issue. So, yeah, this is not settled, not even close. And on top of that, President Trump has already responded by saying he plans to move forward with new tariffs using a different law, specifically Section 122 of the Trade Act. So, even though one door closed, another one is already being opened, which brings up something important. This ruling doesn't mean tariffs are gone. It just means the way they were implemented in this case wasn't allowed. Other types of tariffs, like those based on national security or unfair trade practices, are still in place. So, in a way, this is less about tariffs themselves and more about who has the power to create them. And that's where the bigger picture comes in. The Constitution gives Congress the authority over taxes and trade. And the court is basically reinforcing that boundary, saying the president can't stretch emergency powers too far into areas that are meant for Congress. Now, from the administration's perspective, tariffs have been used as a tool not just for revenue, but for negotiation, for national security, and for pushing back on trade imbalances. There's an argument there that tariffs helped strengthen the U.S. position globally and even addressed issues like drug trafficking and supply chains. On the other side, critics say tariffs raised prices, hurt certain industries, and created uncertainty for businesses. Manufacturing jobs, for example, didn't necessarily see the boost some expected. So you've got this back and forth. And honestly, both sides are making points that are worth understanding. And for you, the key is not just picking a side, but understanding how it affects your day-to-day life. Because at the end of the day, this comes back to your money. If refunds happen, that could mean money flowing back into the economy, maybe into businesses, maybe into households. If they don't, then the impact of those tariffs stays where it is already baked into prices you've paid. And also, there's timing. Even if refunds are approved, this could take years. Court cases, appeals, administrative processes. It's not like flipping a switch. You might remember other situations where government payments took time, sometimes a long time. This could follow a similar pattern, especially with the amount of money involved. And here's something else to think about. If the government does issue refunds or payments, where does that money come from? Because it's already been collected and likely used in the federal budget. So returning it could affect deficits, spending, or future taxes. So yeah, it's not just about getting money back. It's about how the system adjusts around that. So what should you actually do with this information? Honestly, there's no immediate action needed, but awareness is key. Keep an eye on how this develops, especially if you hear about refund programs or policy changes. And also, watch prices, because if tariffs are reduced or removed, you might start to see gradual changes in costs over time. And if new tariffs are introduced under different laws, that could shift things again. So it's kind of an ongoing situation, and who knows, depending on how this plays out, we could see new rules, new policies, or even direct payments, though that part is still very uncertain. So, yeah, definitely something to keep an eye on. And as always, I appreciate you being here, having these conversations, sharing your thoughts, because it really does help make sense of all this together.